So last week, we started looking at the fifth and final example that Jesus gives of what true righteousness is about. And we made the point at that time that there's a sense in which the world does not really understand what love is. That the idea of love has been twisted and changed by the thoughts of the world. And in fact, it's been changed to almost a sense of where love is just about either romance or sex, or it's just indulgent, or it's nice to people who are nice. And we have to understand that God's idea of love is much greater than that. And so when we say God is love, many people in the world struggle with what that means. And the Scribes and the Pharisees, I think, made that mistake also. But I think many Bible believers struggle with it also. And I think the best example of that is when people try to make an artificial divide between God in the Old Testament and God in the New Testament. People will look at the God in the Old Testament and they say, well, that God was jealous and vengeful, but the God in the New Testament, that God is love. And that's not an honest way of looking at the Bible and what it teaches. And I think we do ourselves more damage than good. So we go back to understanding what righteousness is really about. And we used these slides last week to remind ourselves that in the old law, God told the Israelites that they are in fact not to hate your brothers, but you are to love your neighbor as yourself. And so the Pharisees took that and twisted the idea from that to you shall love your neighbor, but you shall hate your enemy. And of course, that was a perversion. So Jesus taught them the correct way of thinking. Love your enemies, pray for those who persecute you. For most of us, this is a very high standard of what it means to love, isn't it? How do I love someone who hates me? How do I love someone who is opposed to me? How do I pray for someone who is hurting me because of what I believe and because of who I am? So the key to understanding this passage is the idea of loving my enemies and praying for them. But we have to be really careful. We can fall into the trap of saying, well, I love my enemies and I pray for the people who persecute me, but I'm doing it because God tells me I have to do it. And that is not sufficient. We're falling into the same trap as the Scribes and the Pharisees. I'm reminded in 1 Corinthians, the 13th chapter, I know I didn't tell you to go to this passage, but in 1 Corinthians 13, the famous passage that's about love, you'll recall that he says in that passage, just verse 3, where he says, if I give away all that I have, and if I deliver up my body to be burned, but have not love, I gain nothing. This is a really instructive passage about what love is. A lot of times when I or others define love, we say it's a selfless love where I'm doing the best for someone else, and it's not about the emotion and the feeling. And there's a sense in which, of course, that's true, but this passage tells us that I can give up everything that I have, which is clearly doing what's best for someone else, and I can do it without love. God's love is more difficult sometimes than we think. I can be completely altruistic and still not fulfill the command of loving and being a person of love as God says. So what is our Father trying to teach us? Well, he's trying to teach us that God is love and that he wants us to be loved too. But love, real love, is very difficult. It's complicated. And it gets really messy sometimes. And that's what we want to look at today, is how do I understand what God's love is when it's so difficult? When we say God is love, that means that everything that God does, he does with love. So destroying the ancient world and all the people who lived on it with a flood, was that God's wrath? Well, clearly, yes. Was it love? When he decimated Sodom and Gomorrah, was that God's wrath? Well, clearly it was. Was it love? I want us in 2 Peter, and apparently, I was told, you guys studied this passage today in 2 Peter 2. So this will be familiar to those of you who were in class. In 2 Peter, the 2nd chapter, beginning in verse 3, Peter gives a warning about people who come as false prophets and false teachers. Now, understand who this category is. These are people who come claiming to be prophets and teachers of God. They don't say, hey, I'm faking it. They come to people and they say, this is a message from God. So these are people who are taking God's word and twisting it, pulling people away from actually following God. These are people who are opposed to God. And he speaks about this thing that is waiting for them. In the end of verse 3, he says, their condemnation from long ago is not idle, and their destruction is not asleep. So here's the dilemma that we have put before us. God is love, but there's also condemnation and destruction. And for a lot of us, those two don't mesh very well. We really struggle with bringing those together. Peter uses 3 examples. He uses the example of the angels. He says God didn't spare the angels who sinned. What did he do with them? He didn't spare them. He put them in chains, committed in gloomy darkness to await judgment. Ouch. Now that doesn't sound pleasant, does it? If you're looking at God as love and saying God is always, hugging people and he's always friendly, well, your idea of God's going to be messed up with this passage, isn't it? And he said he also didn't spare the ancient world. But he sent instead a flood on the world of the ungodly. And he destroyed it all except for a few people and a few animals. And the next example that he gives is of Sodom and Gomorrah. That he condemned them to extinction. I don't know if you've ever stopped to think about that expression, but that's strong language. Condemned them to extinction, to make them an example of what's going to happen to everyone who is ungodly. God is love. Does that sound like love? Extinction? Chains? Gloomy darkness? Doesn't sound like love, does it? At least in our opinion. Now, of course, you have to read in those passages also, which I cleverly, I hope it was clever, skipped over this part, where in contrast to what happened in the ancient world, who did he take care of? Noah. What did he do for Noah? Noah, as a preacher of righteousness, he took care of him. He preserved him in that situation. There's the love. But why just Noah out of all the people in the whole world? And if we look at Sodom and Gomorrah, you also, as you read through that passage, you'll also see that he was actually, during that time, he was taking care of Lot and Lot's family, who he rescued out of that city. Of course, Lot's wife didn't make it much further, but that's another part of the story. But it fits in with the same thoughts that we're dealing with here, doesn't it? When we look at these things, what are we supposed to learn from it? He actually brings that to a conclusion in verse 9. The Lord knows how to rescue the ungodly from trials. Part of what was happening, now it doesn't say that's true for the angels, but it does for Noah and for Lot, shows that God is taking care of those who worship and follow after him. He takes care of it. But he also knows how to hold the unrighteous under punishment. God's love must not be oversimplified as we sometimes want to do. Love requires making hard choices in difficult circumstances. Love requires doing the right thing for the right reason at the right time. And sometimes God's love is going to look to us different than we expect it to. What I want to suggest to you is that when we see God's love, and it's kind of implied in that passage in 2 Peter, is that God's love warns us of the consequences of unrighteousness. It teaches us that we need to fear God. There's a reason for us to honor him. It provides hope in spite of our failures, and it rescues those who are godly. But in doing that, it's very complicated. So now turn your Bibles to the book of Hosea. The prophet of the Old Testament, Hosea prophesied to the northern 10 tribes of Israel at a time when they were very wicked. So Hosea in the Old Testament, the book of Hosea. Hosea was a prophet who was used by God as a metaphor for his relationship with his people, the people of Israel. The man Hosea is instructed to marry a woman who's a prostitute. And through her, they have 3 children. However, predictably, his wife is unfaithful to him and actually returns to her former lifestyle. So she's married to Hosea, she has kids with Hosea, but she really loves her former job and goes back to it. God, in the book of Hosea, portrays himself as a husband, as the husband Hosea, who has been forsaken by his bride, who is Israel. Israel's unfaithfulness was repeatedly demonstrated because they constantly would follow after other gods and after other idols, that they went after the nations and looked for help from the militaries of other nations. And instead of putting all their trust and their hope and their faithfulness in God, who they had a covenant relationship just like marriage, instead of that, they were unfaithful and went a different way. In fact, in Hosea chapter 1, verse 5, you can read about how it says that she said, "I will go after my lovers, who gave me bread and my water, my wool, my flask, my oil, and my drink." And in verse 7, she shall pursue her lovers. I'm going to go after the ones who I'm claiming are giving me all these things. Not is she going to go back to them, but the use of the word pursue means actively follow after. I mean, it's not just I bumped into somebody. I'm looking for going back to that. Their refusal to acknowledge all that Jehovah had done for her was devastating. She claimed everything, Israel claimed everything she had was not from God, but was from the false gods and from the nations. So God describes the nation of Israel as having a heart that's false. Not a heart that was true to God, but a heart that was false, and describes them as rebels. And at one point, poignantly, Jehovah actually asked this question. It's in the 6th chapter in verse 4. What shall I do with you? Do you see and understand God's dilemma in dealing with Israel? What am I going to do with you? I've had many people, when I bring up the example of Hosea, who ask me, why would God have a man do that? That just seems wrong. And of course, it was in order to teach them, but it's also in order to teach us about who our God is and what love, I think, what love really means. Do you understand God's dilemma that he loves someone who takes care of someone, does everything he can, and yet they constantly turn away from them? How is he going to treat her? Well, there's warnings in the book of Hosea. If you look in the 2nd chapter, he gives a whole list of what's going to happen. And you'll see it beginning in verse 3, lest I, and for fear that, as Dan likes to remind us, for fear that, this is what's going to happen to you if you keep following these ways. And I'm not going to read the whole passage, but let me just bring out some of the highlights. Lest I strip her naked and kill her with thirst. I will have no mercy on her. I'll hedge her up her way with thorns. I'm going to build a wall against her. I'm going to take back the grain, the wool, the wine, and the flax. I'm going to uncover her lewdness. I'm going to end all of her feasts and mirth, and I'm going to punish her. What you need to be saying in your head right now is, God is love? That sounds horrible, doesn't it? It doesn't stop there. If you go to the 5th chapter of Hosea, and again, let me just point out the highlights, but you'll notice that he speaks of the judgment that's about to come. Hear this, O priests, pay attention, O house of Israel, give ear, O house of the king, for the judgment is for you have been a snare at Mizpah and spread a net at Tabor. So there is a judgment coming. In verse 9, he describes it as they will become a desolation, utterly destroyed, that they will face a day of punishment. He says he was going to pour out his wrath against them. He describes himself, this explains the picture in the background, that he is going to be like a lion, that he will tear and they go away, that he will carry them off and no one will rescue them. God is love. You say that with a question mark or an exclamation point? God is. Do you see love in this? Because all of these things sound incredibly harsh, don't they? I want us to go to the 15th verse of chapter 5. Where he says, I will return again to my place until all of these things are going to happen, until something changes. And this is where we actually begin to see what the love of God is about. That all these disastrous things that he talks about that sound violent and harsh and difficult have a purpose. He speaks specifically of these things that will happen in their distress. He's trying to get them to wake up. He's trying to get them to see what their behavior is doing. Until, he says, they acknowledge their guilt. They recognize, they have to recognize, we've done something wrong. A woman who is unfaithful to her husband, does she know she's guilty? What does it take to acknowledge that guilt? Because there's one thing knowing that you've done wrong, and there's another thing to be able to say it. To acknowledge it to God, to your husband, to anyone. To say, I've done the wrong. That's what God says. Until you acknowledge your guilt. They knew deep down inside, they knew they had done things wrong. But they weren't ready to acknowledge that. So these bad things are going to happen until you acknowledge, you say, I know that I've done these things wrong. Until you seek my face, he says, until you earnestly seek me. What does God want them to do? Come back. He wants her to come back to him and mean it. And I think that's sometimes where the rub is. All these horrible things that were happening, why were they happening? Is God expressing and demonstrating his love for Israel? The answer for me is yes. And I'm not going to fool you and say it's easy for me to read this and say, oh, I see God's love. This is difficult, isn't it? But what I want you to understand is God is not just mad at Israel. And he's not just punishing Israel. That the things that are happening for a reason and for a purpose, and the expression of that love needed to be there. So look back with me in the 2nd chapter, verse 14. So we see the danger, right? We see the fact that there's clearly going to be difficult times for Israel. But that's not all. In Hosea, the 2nd chapter, verses 14 and 15, let's go ahead and read this, and then we'll notice a few things out of it. This is after he's talked about how completely unfaithful she has been, and all the punishment that's coming on her. It says, therefore, behold, I will allure her and bring her into the wilderness and speak tenderly to her. And there I will give her her vineyards and make the valley of Achor a door of hope. And there she shall answer as in the days of her youth, as in the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. What is God going to do to this bride who's constantly rebelling, whose heart is false? He says, I'm going to allure you. How does God allure us? How does a husband win back his wife when she refuses to be with him, when her heart is not true? He means he's going to be open to her. He's going to entice her to come back. He's going to give her reasons why I'm the one that you should be with, not with those others. It's a strong word, isn't it? Is God content to say with Israel, fine, if you want to be that way, go, be that way? Is he content with saying, if you want to go and be that way, I'm going to punish you? Fine, I'm mad, you get this. No. His love, out of love, he does those things, but he's doing those things to do what? I want to bring her back. And as a part of that, I'm also going to allure her to. I'm going to draw her back to me. And I'm going to be speaking tenderly to her. Some of your translations will be speak to her heart. A heart that's false, but I'm going to talk to it. I want to speak tenderly to this one. I don't know how to do that. Do you? When my kids messed up, my first reaction was not gentle words. Generally, our first reaction when our children misbehave is something sharp. It's something to get their attention. And God says, I'm going to speak tenderly to her. I'm going to give her vineyards. He says, I'm going to speak tenderly to her, and there I will give her vineyards, in verse 15. Her vineyards. He doesn't think of them as his. Her vineyards. He says, and I'm going to make the valley of Achor a door of hope. Achor means trouble. She was in a valley of trouble. Any woman in an adulterous relationship, multiple adulterous relationships, who is completely abandoned her marriage, is in a world of hurt, a world of trouble. She's in the valley of trouble. And God says, I'm going to take her out of that valley of trouble, and I'm going to give her hope. God is love. It's not an easy thing, though. It's a difficult thing, isn't it? And he's really challenging us in these passages to think about, what does it mean when I love someone? Now you'll notice at the end of that passage, he goes back and he says, and there shall answer me as in the days for you, as at the time when she came out of the land of Egypt. So he goes back to the very beginning of their relationship and he says, like at that time, she's going to go back to what it was like at the beginning. Turn to Hosea, the 11th chapter. Hosea, the 11th chapter, where we see that metaphor brought out, but this time, instead of using Israel as a wife, he uses it as a child. Hosea, the 11th chapter, beginning in verse 1. When Israel was a child, I loved him, and out of Egypt I called my son. The more they were called, the more they went away. They kept sacrificing to the Baals and the burnt offerings to the idols. Yet it was I who taught Ephraim to walk. I took them up in their arms, but they didn't know that I healed them. I led them with cords of kindness, with the bands of love, and became to them as one who eases the yoke on their jobs. And I bent down to them and fed them. When Israel was a child, I loved him. Out of Egypt I called my son. I brought my son out of the slavery, brought him into his own land. But the more that I called, the more they went away. Look, just so you know, I'm not this kind of person. If you walk away from me, most of the time, my reaction is fine. And that's not good. I'm not giving that as a good example, but I don't think I'm alone in that thought. How did God feel when the people to whom he had provided everything kept walking away over and over and over again? I loved him. And what did he do for him? Taught him to walk. Do you hear the love? All of us as parents can remember teaching our children to walk. The joy that they have, the joy that we have as we watch them growing and able to move. I taught them to walk. I took them up by their arms. Do you hear the closeness? They didn't know that I was the one that healed them. I took care of them. They didn't even recognize it, but I took care of them. I led them with cords of kindness and bands of love. Do you hear the hugging, right? The enwrapping together. I became to one of them who eases the yoke on the jaws. This is a metaphor from farming, right? I made it so that the work that had to be done was easier. I made her life easier. I bent down to them and fed them. I did all these things for them. Look with me at verse 8. How can I give you up, O Ephraim? How can I hand you over, O Israel? How can I make you like Admah? How can I treat you like Zeboim? My heart recoils within me. My compassion grows warm and tender. I will not execute my burning anger. I will not again destroy Ephraim, for I am God and not a man, the Holy One in your midst. I will not come in wrath. How can I give you up? This passage tears at my heart every time I read it. How can I give you up? Because as I just confessed a few moments ago, that's what I do. I give up. You give up on me, I give up on you. God says, I'm not giving up on you. I will not give up on you. When he says, you'll notice in the 8th verse, the 3rd and 4th lines, how can I make you like Admah, and how can I treat like Zeboim? You guys know those cities? There's an area of Israel dominated by two prominent cities called Sodom and Gomorrah, but also included were the cities of Admah and Zeboim. When Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, so were those two cities. But we've completely forgotten about them. And I think that's God's point here. God is saying, how can I not only destroy you, but make you utterly forgettable? Not going to. God's not going to do that for his people. My heart recoils within me. There's the wrath of God. We never should diminish the wrath of God or the justice of God, nor should we diminish the love of God. My heart recoils within me. She deserves, she needs sometimes some things to be done to draw her back. But he says, my compassion grows warm and tender. I love her. I love this one whose heart is false and who rebels, who turns against me. And yet, what am I going to do? I'm not going to do my anger, and I'm not going to execute my wrath. Does that mean that bad things never happen? Most of us who've studied the Bible know that those things happen. When we think about what happened to the city of Jerusalem because of the Babylonians when they came in, it was unspeakable. God does allow bad things to happen to people to draw them back. God had a plan for Judah at that time. That time was to take Judah into captivity, but when they came back, they were more faithful to God. They learned their lesson. He didn't utterly destroy Israel. I'm a God and not a man. That's where the struggle is for us. God can hold these and understand that it's all love, and that's what we need to be. God is love. Love doesn't give up on those who are heartless and rebellious and immoral and unfaithful until they've utterly given up on him. Love does good to all, even when they were rebellious and heartless. Love excels beyond the expectations and the actions of men. What the world defines as love, we have to go beyond that. Not in the sticky, sweet, syrupy love that the world talks about, but in what real love is. And we have to go beyond that. Real love strives to fix broken relationships. It uses wrath and anger, and yet refrains from it. It disciplines those who have rebelled in a way to bring them back. That's what true love does. And the question that we have to get when we go back to Matthew, the 5th chapter, where he says to us that we are to love our enemies and pray for those who persecute us so that you may be sons of your Father who is in heaven. How am I going to love like he loves? When I say at the beginning of a lesson that love is difficult, you might have thought that was surprising. A lot of us might have said, well, if we do a lesson about the book of Revelation, that's going to be difficult. God is love seems easy. And I'm trying to get you to understand it's much more complicated sometimes than we want to make it. And it requires a lot of effort from us. And we have to constantly look to see how our Father loves so that we can learn to love correctly. And that's why we have books like Hosea, and we have books of the Old Testament that help us see everything that God does so we can learn what it means that God is love. How do I love like he loves? Whether they're my friends or my enemies. I do what's right. I do them good. I help them to overcome sin. I strive to bring them together in a right relationship with God. Be like sons of your Father who is in heaven. Love like he loves. That's my encouragement. Keep studying, though. And I'll keep studying, too, to get a better idea of what that means in so many ways. I hope this lesson's been helpful to you, thinking about what it means, that God is love, and what we need to do to have true righteousness, to have that love. If you need our prayers or help, if you believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and you're ready to be baptized, please come forward as we stand and sing.